Welcome to Insight Bites. I'm Danielle Rissmeyer, and I'm joined here by Roben Allong from Lightbeam Communications. Based in New York, we're based in New York today, where we stopped by the seaport, picked up some bites to talk about some insights. So welcome.
Well, thank you, Danielle, and what an interesting topic to start off 2023 with, right? The idea of diversity, equity, inclusion, and the B being added, which is belonging. New York, melting pot. So I'm so happy that we're here and we've got a little bit of melting pot of different foods to try that represent different cultures. So thank you for having me, and shall we jump right in?
Sure. So today we'll be looking at the B in belonging. So what does that mean, and what does that mean in 2023?
People might say, well, why do we need to add a B? What does that mean? Well, we know that there are differences between what is considered diverse, right? Because you can have a room full of all different people and it is diverse.
Right.
Doesn't mean that everyone in the room is considered equal. Doesn't mean that
like
everyone is right. Everyone feels included. And the belonging is when you think of home, right? You think of a place where you feel comfortable, your voice is heard, and it is given the same weight as anyone else in your environment or wherever you might go.
And being representative of you, and that being showcased, and feeling the level of comfort of everyone around you, embracing you for you.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. And this idea of authenticity. So all of these things are really coming, intersecting at various points, but really coming to the forefront of not just research, but business.
And for some brands too, they're seeing like how people authentically use their product, or who's using it with their family or by themselves, or in different ways that maybe they didn't think of.
Absolutely. As researchers in the research community, whether you are a quantitative researcher or a qualitative researcher or a UX researcher or a CX researcher, an MRX Pro, we have different methodologies of collecting that kind of information. And here you have on social media people being their authentic selves, whereas potentially in front of a researcher that they don't know, they may not necessarily bring their authentic self. Authenticity is key to diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging. Otherwise, it is performative, and we've seen examples of brands that do that say, oh, we celebrate, Martin Luther King Jr. Day, and, and then, their employees of color, may not have the day off, or they may be working in an environment that is, very negative, or an environment where that's filled with microaggressions, things like that. And so when all of that is put on Twitter and other avenues for the public to see, then those companies really get called on the carpet. And I think that is something that's going to happen more and more. And brands' business is complying with inclusivity is going to become a challenge. And I think that is what's going to be trending in 2023, because you have more transparency now, and transparency is only increasing the way that technology increases exponentially. So with that in mind, let's talk about the intersection, right, of commerce, and how does commerce be inclusive? How do they comply with so many different unique individual voices, right? That's the challenge that my clients raise to me all the time. It's like, okay, we can't do marketing for every single being on the planet. Like, that's not how it works.
Right.
So the question becomes, how do we do it? What takeaways from research can we learn? Can we, that will allow us or give us access to these voices in a way that makes sense for the business to continue to run at a profitable rate, because that's what business is all
End of
about.
the day.
It's about profitability. So, how do we arrive there? What are some of the takeaways that companies can do now in order to embrace inclusivity willingly, and not because there's a federal law, a federal HR law or something like that.
So what would be the puzzle piece for the MR companies and how they present and try to conduct their research to get the right answer?
First, with quant, you've got to take an eye more towards culture and the way that you ask your questions.
One thing recently I was reading was like simplifying your questions too, so it reaches a broader audience, and thinking about that.
Absolutely. Here, let me give
Worrying
you
about the language.
a quick example. My company did quite a bit of research for the New York City Department of Health and Mental Hygiene. And when you're dealing with New York City residents, you're dealing with a plethora of types of people, abilities, genders, you name it. New York's got it. One of the things that I learned from the years that I spent doing research there is literacy levels. As researchers, many times, most of us are college educated. We may not have specifically gone to a moderating school or anything like that, but many of us have college degrees, advanced degrees. And so we tend to ask questions and speak to an audience that has the same level
Right.
of comprehension. That is not always the case. Does a quant survey take into account the time that a dyslexic reader needs
Right.
in order to complete? Is it really 10 minutes?
Right.
Or a slow reader?
Dedicating different time to the questions.
Right, so when we say, oh, this survey is going to take you 10 minutes, my 10 minutes as a New Yorker may not be the same 10 minutes for someone who suffers from dyslexia, or for someone who takes a little bit more time to comprehend.
Processing.
Exactly. Consequently, what we talked about a little bit earlier, the idea of simplifying your questions, not using big words. Now, as a qual researcher myself, that is one of the things that I have been practicing for many years in terms of when I ask questions face to face. I keep my language incredibly simple. And when I have a respondent who actually responds with a big word, I ask them to break it down for me, because I may not understand exactly. Yes, we are speaking English, right, but I may not understand what you mean by saying a word like obstreperous. Right,
and their vocabulary of how they're perceiving it may be different too.
Exactly, because, like, for example, we say a New York minute, right? And if you're from New York, you live in New York, a New York minute is really a second, 3 seconds. The rest of the country, a minute is 60 seconds. So we're both speaking English. We both have a time reference, but that time reference may be quite different between the two of us. So as a quant researcher, it is very important to start at the very beginning. Like, are my questions going to be understood in the way that I want them to be understood in order to get the result, the response that I want? All right, so that's number one. And how you can do that is simplifying your language. No one's saying that you have to use slang or any of those things, but really simplifying your language. That's number one. The idea of low income and lack of access, right? It's great that there's research being conducted, but for example, when you think about how to reach them, no, they don't have a laptop in their house. No, they can't do Zoom.
And even the distractions in the backgrounds. I mean, if you're living with multiple people, if you have work schedules, like what timing do you do that?
Exactly.
Like considering all those pieces.
Yeah, and they have mobile phones, but those numbers change, rapidly, because they put money on their phone. They don't have a Verizon plan.
Right.
Like, that is not how it works. So I think it is really incumbent upon us as researchers to actually begin our own disruption and be able to look outside of what we were taught and how we learned to really begin to have communication and discussions that are more relevant, that are more culturally relevant and savvy, so that we're more plugged in, meeting people where they are, instead of expecting respondents to meet the researcher where the research team is. So we're trying different cultures now. Moroccan couscous, we've got Thai chili chicken with mint leaves, I guess representative of Asian culture, or maybe Thai culture, not broad Asian culture, but Thai culture. We've got some pizza with mushrooms, and we've got a raspberry bundt cake, sort of representing more of a European type of baking, right? Yes, okay. So I'll try the couscous first. Let's see what that's like.
I'll try the.
That's actually really good. Spicy, but I like spicy.
Try the chicken.
You got that?
I'm grabbing that. Ooh, it's got like a lime zing to it.
Now it's interesting that both of these have, that sort of addition of spice that is really relative to those cultures, right? I mean, we have that a little bit in the Southwest here in America, the red and green chilies and things like that. But it's interesting to see them incorporated in these dishes.
I think everybody has a little tin of kick.
Yeah, just a little ride, a little zing. So, now we know. It is my belief that we have to look outside of our industry. We have to stop navel gazing. A lot of times, we look to thought leaders in our own industry to borrow ideas from, or to show us the light, to show us the direction we should all move in.
But if we're all doing the same thing for so long, how is that? How are we looking at the same people?
Thank you, Danielle. I'm so glad you raised that point. Because I believe that we should also be looking, in addition to our own thought leaders, we should be looking at other adjacent industries to see what they're doing. How are they addressing inclusivity? Which led me to, because I asked the same question that you did, I looked around and I thought, okay, this isn't really covering what I believe should be covered, because I specialize in microcultures, and there wasn't really a whole lot out there that talked about the unification of all these different cultures. What were the threads? How do you decipher, which culture to speak to directly in order to engage and motivate? That's what brands are trying to do, right? That's the intersection of commerce.
But you also want to be fair too, and not make anyone feel left out.
Right. So you want to adhere to research rules. One of the things that I really sort of want to make clear is the idea of the notion of inclusivity, one of fairness, is really a moral value. Businesses don't really run on morals.
No.
Now, you do have some businesses that thrive. For example, Chick-fil-A has come out and said, we're closed on Sundays. We're a religious organization and we're closed on Sundays, and you're not going to be able to get Chick-fil-A on a Sunday. That's just how it is. And they have been quite successful with that. There are others who haven't been as successful, but that's just an example of, the idea of a business sticking to its moral values. They can do that because there's a tremendous percentage of Christians in the United
Most
States.
areas where there's Chick-fil-A's, yeah.
It's the number one religion, so they can't afford to take that stance without too much
backlash from
Exactly.
their customers and so on.
Right. So then how do we then coax? Who do we look to help us figure out how to coax our clients or businesses to focus more on inclusivity and actually make it part of their strategy? I read an article recently, and they quoted some statistics around inclusivity, thought leadership about it, and how it's incorporated into business strategy. So get this, the statistics, and this was a DNV study, and I think you could look it up on...
DNV?
No, DNV.
Oh, DNV. Okay.
Yeah, it's a company, it's a consulting firm.
I was like, I can't see the DNV.
Right. It's a consulting firm in the energy sector, thinking about adjacent sectors. And basically the research they had done amongst various companies globally was 69%, and I think I'm quoting this correctly, 69% of companies surveyed believed that inclusivity was the right thing to do, that it played a role in business.
They thought, but did they do?
Right? But when it came down to how many incorporated inclusivity as a strategy or part of their core strategy, that percentage dropped to 32%. 32% out of 100% of companies, 32% are giving it a second thought of like, oh, we need to incorporate this into our core strategy for business. Okay, so that means there's a lot of room. There also says to me, a lot of room for researchers to aid in helping these companies to that thought leadership. In order for inclusivity to move forward, especially when it comes to commerce, we as researchers have to engage in diplomacy in terms of convincing, motivating, just like a brand, motivating companies and our clients to incorporate inclusivity as part of their core business strategy, which means that we need to have more studies that directly correlate inclusivity with profitability.
Right. Show them some commerce from it.
Absolutely. We need to show them the commerce story. But we also need to do it diplomatically, because right now what you have is a somewhat divisive environment where many businesses feel, well, if you can't prove it to me, then why should I be engaging? Why should I do research with an audience who is not part of my core? Well, if you want to grow, you're going to have to. I'm looking at the demographics of America. In 20 years, there'll be no Caucasian majority. 20 years will go by in a flash. So
if they want to incorporate any brand loyalty,
right, you have to start right. You have to start now.
So where are we going next?
I'm glad you asked. Where are we going next when it comes to communication with our consumers? And consumers are sort of generally everywhere, right? So the idea, I had written an article some time ago in Quirks with, the idea of arming yourself marketing wise with an understanding of various cultures, so that when you do decide to grow your brand, you're not caught flat-footed. You're not trying to play catch up, because you will already be sort of halfway there, right? The example I'd like to share with you here is one from the Korean government. Most everybody, unless you've been living under a rock, knows about the group BTS, right? It's a boy band, right? Yeah. And you might say, well, what does BTS have to do with research? Well, some 10 years ago, over a decade ago, the Korean government, because Korea is quite small, right? South Korea is a small country, embarked upon what's known as soft power diplomacy, using the power of attraction versus the power of coercion or sort of hardcore demands, which is hard diplomacy. Like, if you don't do this, we won't give you this aid. That's hard power, right? We know that we can't really do that in research, especially not when you're collecting qualitative, right? You
get no responses.
You get no responses, zero. So this idea of attraction, how do we get, just like you were asking me, well, Marvin, how do we get, how do we engage all of these voices? How do we collect this data from everybody and make sure that it's equal?
Incentives can only do so much.
Incentives can only do so much. Absolutely right. With back to the Korean government, with BTS, they embarked on this soft power diplomacy, which was to seed the world globally with Korean culture through something they knew that the world would embrace.
Pop music.
Pop music. And we laugh about it, but guess what?
No,
10 years later, Korea's on the map.
Right.
They're on the map. Not only are they on the map, but tourism is up. BTS has made millions, bazillions.
They have a huge, diverse following, too.
Exactly.
From every age group.
Right. And when you ladder up, governments, like the U.S. government, would all now look favorably on Korea. Now, what was the impetus for them doing it? Was to sort of put the pause button on China. That was the real impetus behind it. It wasn't like, that was what they wanted to do. And the only way to do it, because they're a small country, was not to coerce, but to attract all their allies, attract the eyes of the globe to them. And so this is something that we can do in qualitative research. We know all about soft power diplomacy. We know all about how to attract, how to build cultural bridges. And this is something that we'll need to learn more about and employ more as we go forward. A really poignant quote for me was, and we spoke to people between the ages of 18 and 45.
Okay, big age range.
Big age range, and we broke them down, obviously, into different segments. And the question was in terms of media consumption and how stories are told. This was among African Americans. One of the most poignant quotes to me was when a young man who was, I think maybe 23, 24, said that the right stories weren't told. Sort of, yes, you're telling the African American story, but you're telling it from a Caucasian perspective. Of course, as a qual researcher, you go, tell me more about that.
Right. Here's
What does
the
that
opportunity
mean?
to say it.
Because everybody says, oh, I want my voice heard. Okay, we put your voice out there, and now you're saying, yeah, but it's not really authentic. What do you mean? And what he meant was the anchor people on the channel talked about stories when it came to African American athletes, football players, basketball players. They emphasized the idea that there was always someone coming to save them. There was a white coach who pulled them up out of the ghetto, who gave them an opportunity at a high school or at an NFL team, or who sort of guided their development and things like that. And he said, that's an emphasis on a white savior coming to save us. And without that white savior, that player potentially would not have that opportunity. Because, as black folk, that's great, but we're not interested in hearing that. We've heard that in our entire lives. What we are interested in hearing about is first-person narratives from the athlete directly, and we're more interested in hearing about
biographies,
his family, what his mom did, the idea of a single mom raising 5 kids in a household.
Right,
What was that? What was the impact of that? Yes, we're not interested in hearing that some great white coach saved him. We're interested in, and he goes, and that's the difference.
Who was there day in and day out?
That's right. that is the cultural difference. You're telling the story, but you're not telling it from a perspective that we can appreciate, that lifts up the Black community. Instead, you're telling a story from the perspective of a white colonizer lifting up, a particular athlete.
So how did you follow up with that?
Well, I'm not at liberty to say,
okay.
but needless to say, that was quite an insight for all those researchers who are listening.
Yeah.
You could tell the story, but are you telling it from the right perspective in order to give that brand a competitive advantage? And that, my dear, is culture. That is where culture comes in. Because he clearly pointed out, if you don't really know my culture, then you're not really getting the insights that you need to get to speak to my community.
And you're not seeing the whole picture.
Yeah. So that is why I think that attraction and that soft power diplomacy, the idea of...
And this person felt comfortable telling you that and calling it out.
Exactly.
Yeah.
What can you do to attract versus the idea of, coerce or take a hard line on something like that. And so for those companies out there that, understand what it is to grow an audience and want to grow, knowing that there are different cultures, it's really what is the POV, what is the perspective from which you are telling those stories. And that is why, culture is so important. Understanding microcultures is so important, because if you're not able to reach these cultures, then chances are, you're not going to see the profitability that you're looking for. And that's how you can tie sort of inclusivity to profit. Because now, of course, I can say that the media
outcome?
company in question did change. They acted on those insights immediately, faster than you can say Jack Robinson. And it had a very positive impact. Yes, so far. So yeah, I'm not at liberty to say.
No, but thank you for sharing it. That's a great
yeah.
ending to this. I love it.
So.
And it's thinking about things in different perspectives and what impact it could truly have.
Right.
Thank you.
Shall we dig in?
Yes.
Let's continue to dig in.